starting recording now. And just really wanted to make sure that you all had questions answered, that you knew where things were, kind of the status of different sections of this proposal, and really to dig under some of the things that we're hearing citywide. So, Andrew, I really appreciate you joining us this morning and making time. And I would love to just turn it over to you. We will queue questions in the chat, or just hang on to them until after the presentation, and we will get you in. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Andrew.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Councilwoman Torres, and welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Webb. I'm a senior city planner for Denver Community Planning and Development, and for the last couple of years now, or coming up on 3 years actually, I've been the project manager for this effort to update the Denver zoning code's regulations for residential uses. So that's conventional houses and apartments and condos, all the way across the spectrum to residential care facilities like assisted living and shelters and nursing homes. This is a fairly ambitious project to accomplish several goals. One is to implement our adopted city goals. The zoning code is one of the ways that we adopt a policy plan, or we implement adopted policy plans like Blueprint Denver, like the comprehensive plan. And in this particular project, which we've called the Group Living Project, we're aiming to increase equitable and inclusive access to housing for all Denverites, and also seeking a more equitable approach for locating and the distribution of residential care facilities around the city. We're also aiming to address problems that have long been known with or were recently identified during the course of this project with the Denver zoning code, which has language that dates back to just after the Second World War, has been added to and amended many times, has created multi-layered and in some case mismatched notification and permitting requirements that make it unpredictable for neighbors to know what's coming into their neighborhoods, prohibits the establishment of both needed residential care facilities, especially for our most vulnerable citizens, and also prevents people from simply seeking affordable and flexible housing options that are common in cities all over the world. And then finally, it has the code has a lot of outdated and unclear language due to the age of some of its language. So the zoning code is one of several sets of regulations that govern the use of land in Denver. It specifically regulates the use of private land. Everybody's property is under some zone district, and that zone district has regulations about what can and can't be done with that land. Most of us live most likely in a residential district of some sort, whether it's a SU or single unit, or 2U, TU, 2-unit, or MU, multi-unit district. The code also sets forth regulations for transitions and spacing, appropriate spacing between uses, so we don't over-concentrate certain uses in one place. And has regulations, basic regulations for building form and site design. So setting expectations for structure size and height, regulations about where parking needs to be located relative to the public street, that sort of thing. There are other regulations that govern land use that will not be amended as a part of this project. That includes the Denver Revised Municipal Code, which contains all of the standards for the maintenance of our properties, the maintenance of our lawns, the exteriors of buildings, the alleys, that sort of thing. The use of the public right-of-way, so what we can and can't park in the public right-of-way, is regulated by the Revised Municipal Code. And then the operation of a lot of residential facility types is also regulated by the municipal code. That includes rooming and boarding houses, assisted living, community corrections, more commonly called halfway houses. A lot of residential uses are also governed by city and state regulations outside of zoning and outside of the municipal code, such as licensing for assisted living and rooming and boarding, for example, and then state monitoring of community corrections and halfway house facilities. And then finally, the city's, the Denver Building and Fire Code sets forth the basic regulations for life safety of structures in the city. So appropriate smoke alarms in sleeping areas, egress windows in basement rooms, that sort of thing. That's all in the Building and Fire Code, and these won't change as a part of this project. Here's a little bit about what will change, and then we'll dive into some details. So if adopted as currently proposed, these amendments would consolidate our current long list of residential care uses into one use type. So move away from regulating residential care uses by the housing status or the needs of the people served, and regulate them all by size, and establish a new upfront community meeting requirement prior to application for zoning permits for these types of facilities. So for most residential care facilities, neighbors would be notified by mail of the proposal, would be invited to come to a meeting with the operator and learn more about the project, and potentially enter into private agreements with those providers. We are also proposing to update the regulations for conventional households to allow more unrelated people to live together as part of a household in a typical dwelling unit, but while clarifying regulations that already exist that rent by the room type commercial operations like a rooming and boarding house are not allowed in our lower intensity residential districts, which is shorthand for our single unit, 2-unit, and row house zone districts. And then finally, we're creating a new use bucket in the zoning code for congregate living uses that are essentially non-conventional residential uses where people may have access to their own sleeping quarters, but then share common spaces like kitchens and living areas. That would include things like rooming and boarding, single room occupancy, student housing and dormitories. And as is currently the case, these uses would only be permitted in higher intensity zone districts like multi-unit, mixed use, some of the corridor districts like commercial corridor, that sort of thing. So to dig into a little bit of the details, here are the proposed changes for residential uses, for household uses. Currently in Denver, we regulate single unit uses, so typical detached houses, and then everything else, apartments, condos, and other multi-unit uses, even duplexes, differently. So in a single unit use, we allow 2 partners or 2 unrelated adults to live together currently with unlimited family members of any age. And there are currently not off-street parking requirements for single unit houses, for detached houses. And then in everything else, so duplexes on up the spectrum, we allow up to 4 unrelated adults to live together with unlimited family members of any age. There are minimum off-street parking requirements for multi-unit uses. And this has been a challenge for us because it basically means that non-conventional families who are not all related to each other by blood are only allowed to live in apartments and multi-unit uses, which are on average about 800 square feet, about half the average size of Denver's detached housing stock, which makes up about 70% of the city's total housing stock. So what we're proposing is to regulate all dwelling units the same and allow in any dwelling unit up to 5 adults of any relationship with, again, preserving the existing allowance for unlimited relatives to each in any dwelling unit. Allow more unrelated adults in larger houses. So basically any house that is over the Denver median house structure size of 1,600 square feet. For every additional 200 square feet of finished floor area, 1 additional unrelated adult would be permitted to live in the home. But we're proposing to add a new minimum off-street parking requirement for these households, for larger households and single unit uses. So as I mentioned, we don't currently require off-street parking for houses in Denver. This would be a new requirement for houses with 6 or more adults, regardless of relationship, that they would have to have at least 1 or 2, in most cases 2, especially in your district, in your zone districts, 2 off-street parking spaces. This slide shows how some peer cities regulate unrelated adults living in households, as well as average household size in those cities. So as you can see in most peer cities west of the Mississippi with similar geographies to Denver, and most cities in the Front Range allow 4 to 5 unrelated adults to live together as a household in houses. But even in cities that allow way more than that, as we get over toward the West Coast, but also Austin and some other cities allow 6 or more unrelated adults to live as part of a household. But even in those cities where these more flexible allowances have existed in most cases for decades, average household size stays generally the same, suggesting that people generally choose to live together about the same as they do anywhere else, regardless of what regulations say. But this would allow for, by increasing the number here in Denver, our fairly conservative standard would allow for more households of people who live as the functional equivalent of a family but are not related by blood to live together in a house. So for residential care, the current and proposed regulations are shown here. Current is on the left. We currently regulate residential care in 2 sizes, large or small. Both of the residential care types are permitted in neighborhoods now, and there are of about 140 total residential care facilities in the city and county. About 60 of those are in neighborhoods and are actually in house structures. Most of those are assisted living and recovery type homes. Cities are required by the Federal Fair Housing Act and by the state group home statute to accommodate groups of people in certain, those regulations call protected classes. And it's typically people who have a intellectual or physical disability, people in recovery, that sort of thing. We do, for larger facilities, currently have some spacing and density requirements that prevent them from over-concentrating in any one block or neighborhood, and those would be retained and pulled into the new system, which would still have spacing requirements between facilities and density requirements limiting the total number of facilities in any one area. I should note that currently shelters and community corrections, which are more commonly called halfway houses, are considered residential care facilities, but are regulated. They have additional regulations and buffer requirements on them. We are proposing in this project to change that by regulating them the same as we would any other residential care facility. Making the argument that especially community corrections, which are very difficult to establish and currently are allowed only in industrial districts, which typically abut some of our most vulnerable and underserved neighborhoods. So these changes would allow for community corrections facilities to exist pretty much anywhere in the city, as are other residential care uses, to allow for, in zoning, a more equitable distribution of those facilities around the city. And I will just note that for any use serving more than 11 adults and any facility that is a community corrections facility, which again is a formal facility that works in partnership with the city to house people who are transitioning from a period of incarceration back into community, any of those, regardless of size, would have to have an upfront community meeting with mailed notice to neighbors. So we took this to Planning Board in August, which did recommend approval of these amendments. And since then, we've been discussing these amendments with the City Council's Land Use, Transportation, and Infrastructure Subcommittee, which considers all land use issues before setting them on to the full City Council for a final vote. We've heard some concerns from council members on the LUTI Committee and other council members who are participating in those discussions. Generally about the difficulty of understanding the full scope of a very large project in the context of a single meeting. Some concerns about former Chapter 59, more commonly called the old zoning code, which is still in effect in about 20% of the city, primarily on the east side of the city where Denver interfaces with Aurora, and then in the southeast and southwest corners of the city. There were also some concerns about household size, concerns that the current proposal would effectively allow unlimited number of adults to live in a house. We would note that currently an unlimited number of family members can live in a house, but we understand that by allowing more unrelated people to live together, there's concerns about just very large households of people. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're proposing for that. And then generally concerns about residential care, especially community corrections uses in neighborhoods, and enforcement of all zoning issues in general. So as a result, we've worked with the Land Use, Transportation, and Infrastructure Committee chair to set up a series of subject-specific discussions where we're coming back with some potential alternatives for council members to consider as possible revisions to these amendments. We did go back to the LUDI committee earlier this month on the 6th and proposed a few alternative approaches to regulating households that would provide for more flexibility for unrelated adults to live together, but would establish some guardrails to prevent those concerns about very large households of adults. We will be going back then in early November to tee up a longer conversation about residential care, and then we'll come back on the 10th for a full meeting discussion about residential care with some possible revisions for the members to consider. We'll be back then again in mid-November to talk about our proposed solutions for addressing the former Chapter 59 or the old code, some proposed approaches to improve enforcement, and especially to make people more aware of the outcomes of enforcement. And a program that we're working on for post-adoption monitoring, where we'll be watching multiple metrics as a result of this project after adoption over a period of years to ensure that we have not had unintended consequences. And if so, we would then explore some potential amendments to correct those. So we are planning to come back then after this series of meetings at LUDI to the committee one more time in early December, where we would ask them for a recommendation out, a final vote out to the full city council. If they do vote to move it out of LUDI at that time, that would mean that we would most likely have a city council final public hearing sometime in January of 2021. All these meetings are public, and you are encouraged to tune in and learn more. I would also just highlight here on this slide the project website, denvergov.org/group living. We have all of the presentations we've ever given over the almost 3 years of this project, including summaries of meetings of the Group Living Advisory Committee, which considered the problem statements and proposed solutions over a couple years. We are also taking feedback for City Council as this moves through the LUDI process, and you're welcome to send your feedback to me. My contact information is there, and I'm also always happy to answer questions. And we, on the website, also have several opportunities for people to meet with us, essentially virtual office hours. We've been doing them every Thursday, alternating from daytime to evening, to provide people opportunities to sit down and kind of go through some of their problems. So with that, I'll step back and allow folks to ask their questions. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much. And I'm grateful. I think you've been able to pull a lot of information into just a handful of slides. So less than 10 slides to describe this is really, it's digestible. So I really appreciate that. I've opened up the unmuting control. So if there are folks who are interested in asking a question, or you're more than welcome to put it into the chat and I can ask it for you. Please feel free to do that. I have some prompt questions, but I'll wait a second to see if anybody wants to go first. Not seeing anyone yet. Andrew, can you tell me, because I wasn't in council when this project was initiated, what was the compelling factor for the city to take this on? Does it kind of raise during blueprint, or was it even before that the city thought this needs to be looked at?
Yeah, great question. So I would say in 2017 was when we first started kind of seriously having these conversations about updating these regulations. And a few things were sort of coming together at that time. There had long been knowledge that the city's regulations for shelter uses were were very convoluted and hard for people to understand, and difficult for operators to decide which of the shelter regulations actually pertain to them. There were also some some ineffective public outreach requirements for shelter uses in particular that had been found hard to implement. Similarly, we knew there was some desire to look at some additional flexibility for community corrections or halfway house type uses. There was a moratorium on the establishment of new community corrections uses that was at that time about to expire, and it did expire in 2018. And that raised the question of, where could we actually put these facilities where they wouldn't be further concentrating more of our most vulnerable citizens in industrial areas where they have no access to transit and day-to-day needs. And then we also knew, as we were hearing about the challenges people faced with finding housing in general, that the current regulations around unrelated adults and related adults limited people from what are very common living arrangements of like two families sharing a house together, or simply a group of unrelated people sharing a house together. And as the city at that time was looking at how to improve access to housing, that rose up as a key issue. And so it was decided then to pull together an advisory committee of people with lived and occupational experience with the code. And we did do that, and really dug into understanding all the different types of residential uses, from market rate housing to residential care, and understand how they work and how they're impacted by the code, so that we could propose some amendments that would bring the code up to date with how people live together and how services are provided.
That's great background. I know some of the questions that I've received from community who either are concerned about this or just are trying to picture, what could happen if something like this were to take place. I think it's swung to what's the most extreme scenario, and some of that is the language around allowing up to 10 adults in a household. What are the circumstances for this exactly, and how common have you found it to be, either in Denver or in other cities?
Yeah, so we know that there are a handful of very large family households currently in Denver, but it is literally a handful. So about maybe 2% of homes are 6 or more adults in Denver. Most are, as you saw on the average household size slide, or more in the 2.5 person range. But we know that increasingly there are people doubling up, families doubling up, for instance, to share housing costs, and we know that there is a demand. Originally, we had proposed, back when we went to the community in February and March during a series of open houses that we held, we were proposing up to 8 adults in a household with relatives to each. And there were a lot of concerns then. We heard about just no limit effectively on the number of people in a household. And so we have since kind of brought that number, that base number, back from 8 to 5. Preserving the current allowance for unrelated adults to make sure that we're not making any, multi-generational families non-conforming. But we did propose a maximum number of 10 unrelated adults in a household. And I should note that any household with more than 10 people, regardless of relationship, has to have sprinklers in Denver. So there are other guardrails kind of outside of zoning. But we do, we're trying to balance here, allowing for people to make choices about how they want to live together and what they want to do with their houses and properties, allowing some of our larger houses, larger structures, to accommodate more people, which they can do comfortably and safely. And try to avoid arbitrary limits to as best we can, especially because we know that while there will always be a spectrum of housing sizes, lots of one-person households and some larger households, that generally we would expect that if these regulations change, that average household size will stay pretty much the same.
The enforcement. So this slide is one of the most interesting slides to me, because what it showed me immediately was that there really wasn't a whole lot of variety or variation from an under 3 really average in any city, no matter what size was permitted for unrelated adults in a household, all the way up to 8. Those folks were even under Denver. Seattle specifically was even under Denver in terms of average household size, but it allowed 8. So while it gave that kind of flexibility, the vast majority of homes in Seattle were not utilizing that. Didn't need to, but it was there if they did, I guess.
Yeah.
When it comes to enforcement, this was something that Tina, the zoning administrator for Denver, commented on. When neighborhood inspection services is called on a house where somebody says there's too many people living in that house, that's got to be a violation of the zoning code. How often are those calls found to be in violation? And then when they are, about how many unrelated people actually live there?
So we have on average about 180 cases that are opened in a given year, and it varies widely by year. You may recall Tina gave some data, and it was like 60 one year and then 90 another year. On average, 180 cases are open, and about half of those, or about between 80 and 90, are found to be actual violations of the zoning code. And as is the case in any other city, our inspection teams ask people for what their relationships are, and we start with kind of a knock on the door and ask people to tell us, if they're all related or how they all came to live there. And then the city can ask for more documentation of relationships if it is unclear. Of those where people are found to be living together in violation of the code, it is typically in the realm of between 3 and 5 adults living in a house, and often it is groups of roommates. We see concentrations of these calls coming in around the neighborhood where I live, right by DU, and around Regis. The challenge we have is that these rules, not only do they prevent people from simply just seeking housing options, but they also become a tool of gentrification in neighborhoods where there has been a neighborhood tradition of larger families living together or multi-generational families living together. And then as demographics change in a neighborhood, people start calling in their neighbors, and as we see from the data, half of the calls that come in often are found to actually be families living together. And so we see this a few ways from the enforcement standpoint, where actually our enforcement staff is supportive of making these changes to allow more flexibility, because they, working on the ground, see people needing additional flexibility in housing. And they also would like to be able to focus their time on the more egregious situations where there are a lot of external impacts. Often in very problematic situations, we'll see additional things like lack of maintenance and yard parking and that sort of thing, and allowing our inspection teams to move their focus towards those particularly bad situations, we think will increase the effectiveness of enforcement.
So 2 questions in the chat, Andrew. What constitutes living in a household as opposed to maybe an extended visit?
That's a great question. Thank you, Jean. It is so. When if those of you are familiar with the short-term rental program here in the city, short-term rentals are any use that somebody pays for housing for less than 30 days. And anything that is 30 days or more is considered permanent occupancy, like a month-to-month rental, for example. If an extended visit, we don't really have regulations on how long guests can stay in a house. We do have regulations, of course, on, for instance, you can't have people staying in an RV on your property or in the public right of way. But there are no specific regulations for how long a guest can stay in a house, though in an enforcement situation, inspectors would ask, how long have you resided at this residence? Are you paying to stay at this residence? And if people are paying to be at a residence, then that is considered long-term occupancy, and the current or future occupancy standards would apply.
Thank you, Andrew. A couple questions from Jaime. Why does it have to be 10? Why does that have to be the limit? And noting that I think that is a number that scares people, like in our neighborhood,
Yeah.
which is Villa Park, comprised of single family, under 1,100 square foot homes, most 40% owner occupied. Why not use this data for the average household to guide that number?
Yeah, great question. So, and just to clarify, when we say 10, we are talking about 10 unrelated adults in the largest houses. So if adopted as currently proposed, where people could have more unrelated adults in a much larger house, a house that's 2,600 square feet or larger could have a maximum of 10 unrelated adults. There is currently not a limit on the number of related adults that are allowed to live in any house. And so conceivably, currently, a family of 12 could live in a studio apartment if they wanted to. And we are always again trying to balance different needs. We know that one of the key solutions for homelessness is to prevent people from becoming unhoused in the first place. And so if people are having to live in a higher number of people in a smaller space, there are some advantages in terms of safety and health to that than not having a place to live. But we understand that concern, and we know that allowing up to 10 adults, unrelated adults plus relatives, has raised some concerns. And so when we went back to the Ludi committee earlier this month, we proposed a few solutions that would set some outer limit, especially on unrelated adults, that is perhaps lower than 10, while still preserving potentially as kind of an either or approach, the allowance for unlimited relatives to live together. We are also discussing some possibilities that would just have regulations on number of adults across the board, regardless of relationship. And we're having ongoing discussions with council members now to understand, what should we prioritize here? What is most important? In terms of that number, we got to that because 10 is an existing threshold in the building code for fire sprinklers, and because of the high expense and complication of adding sprinklers to an existing home, we know that there are very few homes that would actually get to that threshold, but we did want to have some upper boundary that seem aligned with an existing building code standard. But certainly we're willing to consider the council's input if they think a lower number is more appropriate, if for no other reason than to reduce the concerns about very large numbers of people living in a small house.
And I think to Jaime's question about the size of homes that we tend to have in West Denver, the addition above kind of the base of 5 starts at 1,600 square feet, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So in the 900 to 1,100 square foot homes that you reference, you would no more than 5 unrelated adults would be permitted in a family group in that household under the current proposal.
Okay. Jean had a follow-up. Does the zoning code, her follow-up is, will a landlord be able to limit the number of adults, if they so choose, to less than the allowed number, or require all adults to be on a lease? Is that something that is governed by this zoning?
Another great question. So a landlord can limit the number of adults. A landlord or an HOA for a condo or something like that, they can have less expansive regulations than zoning, as long as they're not more permissive than zoning. The city is silent on that. And so a landlord can say, only X number of people, the same as they can say only a certain number of pets can live in the home. In terms of leases, we would consider these on a case-by-case basis. So I'm going to see here if I have, this is the proposed definition for a housekeeping unit. I've pulled up on your screens here. I won't read through the whole thing, but I'll just summarize to say that what we're talking about when we're talking about a nonprofit housekeeping unit is a group of people who have jointly chosen to live in a dwelling unit, who share day-to-day activities and expenses, and whose coming and going to the home is not managed by some outside third party. And so the intent there is to be very clear that if you are just renting a room and you don't know who any of the people in the house are and you just have access to your room, that is rooming and boarding use not allowed in a typical house, not allowed in low intensity residential zone districts. We would not necessarily require that a group of people who are a nonprofit housekeeping unit and who are jointly occupying the property to all be on the same lease. We don't really get into into the requiring the way landlords do that kind of business. However, lease information may be requested in an investigation on a case-by-case basis as evidence of relationships.
And when you say nonprofit housekeeping unit, you're saying something that's not commercial or business, not necessarily kind of the 501c3 definition of a nonprofit.
That's correct. Yeah. So we currently have this word. There are phrases in the zoning code right now, nonprofit housekeeping unit, but it's undefined, and it has been a problem because it has led people to, think it means many different things. And so we're trying to be specific here that, we do understand that landlords and mortgage companies and other providers of housing are making a profit. But what we're referring to is that the people themselves are not living as a business in the house, and that the house is not a money-making operation, basically. And so trying to be clear that commercialized app-driven services, for instance, like bungalow.com or more old-fashioned rooming and boarding type houses are only allowed in higher intensity zone districts where you would see those kind of uses elsewhere.
And so that does not include single unit, 2-unit. Are there more, or row home?
In row home, that's correct.
Okay. So on the subject of homelessness, Jessica asks, we know that homelessness is increasing rapidly due to COVID. How is enforcement working currently? I would rather be flexible on this than see more families and children become unhoused. Yeah. Is there flexibility right now? Are we easing up on enforcement here, and are resources being offered? So some might be outside of your purview, Andrew, but I think there's a couple things in there that relate to this specifically.
Yeah, and actually this is something I'm very familiar with because my team works very closely with our development services and the zoning administrator and our enforcement group. And I can tell you that actually in response to COVID, we have deprioritized by written policy within the department the enforcement of occupancy standards in houses. For this exact reason, that we know people are needing to help out their friends and family, that housing is particularly tenuous right now as people face eviction and job loss. And so the zoning administrator determined that the unrelated and related adult standards shall be the lowest priority for enforcement for our zoning neighborhood inspections team until the pandemic ends or some amended zoning regulations are adopted. And has directed our enforcement staff to focus on the external impacts. So if there is yard parking or lack of maintenance, that sort of thing, they've been instructed to focus on rectifying and bringing those issues into compliance, but while deprioritizing regulations that could result in people having to move out of housing.
And I know that our office has reached out to each of the designated neighborhood inspection service folks from CPD whose territory is kind of within or surrounding District 3, because we want to also know about those vulnerable households as well. So are they folks who are seniors who can't maintain property? Are they people with disabilities? And especially as winter comes, there become a variety of different neighborhood inspection kind of cases or things that they see that we may not see, and so we're making sure that we're in close communication with those teams as well, because we'd rather see resources go to those folks rather than just enforcement over things that could be addressed. One question Elizabeth is asking, and this relates to, I think, the relationship that this may have with housing costs, with density. So her question is, there are many millennials where there are multiple people living together now. Why a major change to zoning for just 80 cases? This is a red herring. Seattle's increase in density has resulted in higher costs, not lower costs, and has aggravated the homeless problem. It has benefited developers at the cost of low-income residents. How much study has gone into other cities who have done this?
So we have what we have not been able to find is an existing body of academic research that ties housing costs, housing value, real estate value, and rental prices to occupancy standards. And it's challenging because all the other cities on that slide that showed all those other cities have had those regulations on the books for decades. Only 2 cities that we could find have made these changes recently, and they're not very comparable to Denver. Bend, Oregon, and Burlington, Vermont, both of which are much smaller cities with very different economics, have made changes like this very recently, and we'll certainly be watching them closely after adoption to see how those places change. But we did reach out to colleagues in Seattle and in several other cities, Seattle, Austin, to find out how their housing models compare. Basically, we wanted to know, do you actually see more people living in sort of large non-related households, and could they look back to the time when these changes were adopted and observe if any changes happened? And anecdotally, none of these cities said that there was a new model of housing or the provision of rental housing, that sort of thing. We know that that real estate value and rent prices are driven by so many different factors, and we were not able to find anyone or any study that could draw a direct connection between allowing more unrelated people to live together and the cost of housing or the cost of rent. But it's certainly a really important question, and actually as one of the metrics that we're committing to study for post-adoption monitoring, if these amendments are adopted, would be looking at the housing tenure and the rate of rental versus housing ownership. And we would certainly be interested in monitoring that and rectifying any regulations that had unintended consequences there.
And Andrew, I'd add the historical nature of why a lot of cities are revising their zoning code has to do with really eliminating some of the ways in which discrete racism or discrimination were embedded into zoning to keep some folks in some parts of a city and some folks in other parts of a city, which was very real, even for Denver. And so the limit on number of unrelated has a direct impact on our LGBTQ community, who kind of create family in a household as opposed to perhaps living with all of their relations. But I think there's a lot to kind of the historical nature of why some of this large of a change might be happening, and then wanting to get into kind of the other half of reform that you're looking at with that looks at residential care facilities. That part of this is also, it has a lot of that, a lot of those issues embedded in it. And TC asked a question around homelessness. Could you elaborate on how this proposed amendment would help mitigate homelessness? And I think there's a couple different areas where it tries to do that.
Absolutely. So first, I want to say that this is only one of many projects that the city is, and efforts that the city is conducting to address homelessness. But one of the things that is known about addressing homelessness worldwide is that providing housing or ensuring housing as a first step is one of the most important, if not the most important, part of addressing homelessness. And so these amendments would address homelessness in several ways. The first is that by simply allowing more flexible use of existing housing, we would reduce the instances where people who are living together who are not related are asked to vacate a home, and people are left then having to go find other housing. So by allowing that flexibility, we allow people to stay housed in the first place. these regulations would also make it so shelters are currently allowed in most zone districts, but the regulations and the use limitations and definitions are fairly outdated and complicated, and it's unclear who's allowed to operate a shelter here. And so these regulations would allow for the establishment be more clear about, I should say, where shelter type uses can be established. And then finally, we've seen an evolution in the model of providing services to people experiencing homelessness, to moving away from the overnight emergency shelter that everybody gets bused to in Northeast Park Hill every night, to a more residential approach where people actually have access to a space 24 hours a day, and to facilities that provide a continuum of housing on one site. So the Dolores project is a good example of this, where they have an emergency shelter, and then they also have transitional housing, which is where people can kind of begin to have a little bit more autonomy in their living space. And then they also have permanent supportive housing on site, which is regulated just like apartments, and people have access to their own dwelling unit. And the regulations currently prevent the establishment of multiple residential care use types on one site. And so one of the things that these changes would do is make it clear that while individual sites where these uses are provided need to be spaced apart so that we don't have a concentration of services in any one area, at a single site, you can have different types of care provided, and there's not the same, not as rigid a requirement that if you are a transitional housing, that's all you can provide. And so it allows operators to have additional flexibility to provide a continuum of housing on one site, which helps guide people from the experience of homelessness back into long-term conventional housing.
That's such a good point, and thanks for mentioning Dolores Project, which is in the West Colfax neighborhood in District 3, and a really wonderful, I think, example of how some of that layering can happen.
Yeah.
One of the questions that's been asked is around whether it's homeless shelters or community corrections facilities. Is there a built-in buffer either from one another or from institutions like schools?
So, as currently proposed, there is currently a buffer requirement of 1,500 feet required from a community corrections or halfway house to a school, and there are also smaller buffers for shelters to a school. We are proposing to eliminate those for several reasons. One is that those buffer requirements are fairly arbitrary. There's no research out there anywhere shows that having a buffer requirement like that actually has an impact on safety. We also have looked at the data over the last decade for safety around facilities, especially community corrections facilities, and there is no instance of property or violent crime in the last 10 years that can be near a facility that can be directly associated with a tenant of, a resident of, or the presence of the facility in the neighborhood. And so we are proposing to move away from those buffer requirements. And in terms of how other cities do it, it does vary. Some cities also do have those buffer requirements to a school, and many do not. But what we've learned is that most of them are adopted because the uses sound frightening and intimidating, and I can understand that. I have a child in Denver public schools. But in reality, they don't actually result in additional safety. But what they do result in is a lack of land where you can actually establish a facility like this in the city. So as is currently proposed, those current buffer requirements would go away. Is that the whole question, or did I skip part of it?
No, I think that's definitely it. In just the last several minutes that we have left here, one of the things that I wanted to mention, which are the very real kind of personal impacts on some of these things, particularly related to helping keep folks from becoming unhoused, and where homeless shelters and homeless serving facilities can open up in the city. One is that we may know folks who can lend kind of even their own personal story to how this worked out. But for me, when we became unhoused when I was a teenager, we ended up teaming up with other single moms who were kind of banding together, and it was a temporary kind of fix to then when we did find an apartment for just our family. So the need and kind of the very real nature of how this supports folks from even over a temporary period of time for just having shelter with somebody that they know and trust is a very real thing and would have not been allowed by the current Denver zoning code around unrelated adults. The other piece is that a lot of our unhoused folks are families, like mine was, and so their proximity to a school might actually be a benefit. But we've not been able really to kind of explore that as a city because of land availability or zoning restrictions throughout the city. And the third is what I see this doing is trying to get us to a place of equality where any community in the city is looking at this through the same lens of access and inclusion, and not just District 3 or District 9 or District 10, which is downtown, and some of where kind of we currently see the concentration of both services as well as living facilities. So I just wanted to add those things in there. A couple follow-ups. This one might be easy for you to answer, Andrew. Are tiny homes considered under the group living provisions? Can
Yes.
you? Okay.
So tiny homes as a, just where people simply live and go about their day would be considered a congregate living use and would be permitted uh, in a place where those types of uses are allowed. And I should clarify that currently somebody could conceivably put up a tiny home village, a permanent tiny home village now. The things that prevent that from happening are several fold. Land value and land cost make it more economically feasible to build vertical to build a taller building of multi-stories where those uses are allowed, and that is where tiny home type uses are allowed. These proposed amendments would not allow more dwelling units on sites that currently allow only one or two dwelling units. So it's not changing single family zoning or duplex zoning to allow more actual kitchens and dwelling units. But it would allow the establishment of tiny homes and tiny home villages on properties where multiple units are allowed. And this gets into kind of planarese, but where multiple primary unit or structures are allowed to exist on a zone lot in the city. So yes, so they would be considered the same as we would consider a single room occupancy or like a dormitory, and would be allowed in higher intensity zone districts. Where in a tiny home scenario where care is provided, that would be considered as a residential care use. And the main difference there is that in residential care, there is more additional parking required for staff. And then for any type of tiny home village that is not a temporary village, those villages would have to meet our zoning code's current requirements for buildings to be built up at the street in some of our main street and commercial corridor districts, to have pedestrian access and transparency and that sort of thing. So I see a question about that, actually, about the 4-year limit on temporary tiny home villages. I do want to clarify that temporary tiny home villages are a different thing. With temporary tiny home villages, we've given relief from building form requirements in the code. So you can use, soft-sided structures for common spaces, and you don't have to meet your zone lot that you're build to and building transparency requirements, or parking or surface paving and that sort of thing. Temporary villages are only allowed to exist for a maximum of 4 years. A permanent tiny home village would have to meet the zoning code requirements for the actual appearance and location of structures on a site so that it fits in with the surrounding built environment.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And would you mind going to the timeline slide that you have of kind of what's coming up next for this process. The question was raised around when do we anticipate these changes being voted on, which I think is a really good question.
Mhm. Uh,
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I was just going to say we expect to ask the Ludi committee for a final vote on what I expect will be some revised form of the current proposed amendments on December 1st. And then that would move it into the full city council process, and we would expect they would most likely hold a final public hearing on these amendments in January of 2021.
Okay, so several more meetings. There, Ludi meets on Tuesdays at 10:30, and those are all televised. And each of these dates are bound to be some pretty robust discussion about what Andrew and his team have been working on. So I just want to thank everyone for tuning in today. We will make this video available. And Andrew, if you have any last words.
Well, I'll make one more plug for our project website. We do actually post all the upcoming meetings on that site. And one quick detail, the Ludi chair has actually allowed us to start at 10 for these longer meetings. So the 10th and the 17th will actually begin at 10 a.m. So that we can have additional time for this discussion from 10 to noon. We post all the meeting information on our project website in advance. We also have this slide deck, as well as many other far more detailed slide decks on our site, and we have a great timeline actually of the adoption of our original zoning code in the First World War era, and its evolution over the years to where it stands now. That may be of interest to folks who want to know more about how we got to the current regulations that we have. So again, that's let's see. There it is, denvergov.org/group living. And thank you all very much for your interest and great questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And refer folks to our Facebook page where we'll have this presentation up over the weekend. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.